you guys? This is your girl Krystal Holliday. Welcome to another episode, and we're gonna learn more about poetry, poetics, and also a little hip hop. But right now we have one of my professors from UNT here, Dr. Bruce Vaughn. Say hi to the people. This is a seasoned poet here, an experienced writer. He has not one, not two, not three, but over 20 books, 23 books. That's a lot of books. And some new releases, or some more recent releases. You want to tell us about those real quick?
Oh, okay. Yeah, last year I published a book called Frankenstein's Children, which, it looks at artificial intelligence and advertising and our modern world through the lens of Mary Shelley.
Where can we find your book? If people
You can find my books on Amazon. They're all over the place.
Very cool, very cool. I just have two questions since you are my poetry instructor.
Yeah.
So what is poetry exactly?
Oh, that's a good question. I like to think of poetry as something that we're all engaged in. It's been defined a lot of different ways, and sometimes people define it trying to define also what is a good poetry or a good poem. But language under pressure is one definition that's often very useful. It certainly is language that is singular. In other words, if you were to change the language in any way, you would lose something. So when language is wedded to its original form, then it approaches poetry. But poetic meaning is kind of a subcategory, if that makes sense, right? And it has to do with metaphor, with poetry that means more than one thing at any one time. So when I say that everyone's engaged in poetry in some way, I'm including jokes, songs. Whenever people pun, that's a subcategory of joke, but it's a particular kind of event in language, right, where you have to get that word, right? These are things that people universally do and they universally like.
So poetry to you is like a genre of speech or a genre of language expressing itself.
Yes, but it's language that's working a little harder than your average language, where it's not just talking about the world, but creating a memorable experience in the process where we feel strongly about the world. Right? So it evokes a very strong feeling, and it does that through all these techniques we associate with poetry, and one of them is music. So that's it.
Very good. And the general population will probably associate poetry with music, lyrics.
That makes sense. Yeah.
We're going to have a lot of general audience, so that's cool. And my last question for you is, what have you experienced is a common misconception about poetry?
Well, I think one common misconception is, what's that?
Talk to the camera.
Oh, okay. One common misconception is that it's simply what people study in school, that it has a specialized language associated with it. Really, poetry can make use of any language. It can be about any subject. Often when it's associated with speech, there's a kind of intimacy with it, but speech just naturally evolves all kinds of new specialized ways of operating it. The new metaphors and new diction is coming into being all the time in speech. So it's the condition of speech to be kind of poetic. That is, to invent a new way of expressing human experience. You can look at a poem as kind of a new word for a new feeling or idea or constellation of those things. So I think sometimes I get students who they say they don't like poetry. but it's because they didn't like the experience of studying it in school.
Right.
And oftentimes it's approached as if it's a foreign language.
Right.
So I would say no, it's the language you already speak. It's the things that are inherently poetic, they're embedded in your speech already,
And
no matter who you are.
that's going to be great for me to know, because I'm going to do interviews with the general public about poetry.
Yeah.
And I can associate the reason why
Yeah.
they feel that way about poetry and relate it to.
Sure.
So that's,
Yeah.
very good.
I try, every now and then in my intro classes, I'll get someone taking the classes who says they don't like poetry. And it's basically because they've been made to feel foolish in school, or the poems they were presented weren't enough about their lives. But poetry, it can come from anywhere. It can be about anything. It can use all kinds of approaches to language, all kinds of vocabularies. So the first thing I try to do is work on metaphor. Because we all love metaphors. People generally love metaphors. And there's something inherently poetic in the use of a metaphor. And you let go of trying to control the language and just being kind of literal, where there's a one-to-one relationship between what you say and what it refers to. That's more of a prose approach. That's more about conveying information. But poetry is about evoking a response. There's information in it too. But most important is creating an experience where the reader feels like they're not just taking in information, but they're imagining as they go. Does that make sense? They're having fun. It's a form of play. Even when it's tragic, there's a form of imaginative play that's going on.
What do you think about the contemporary culture and the field of poetry right now, as far as they relate to each other? Where do you think the state of it is right now as they relate to each other?
It's extreme. Poetry is extremely healthy. It's never been more popular.
Really?
Yeah. I just got back from a conference. It's writers from all over the country, and that conference gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Wow.
And more poetry is selling. So we're in a kind of renaissance. There are a lot of writers. There are a lot of different approaches to poetry to choose from. But we're in a very healthy state right now. I think opening up questions, we used to say contemporary culture, questions related to identity, that's very important to poetry right now. So there are a lot of new realms of experience that are finding expression in poetry. That's drawing a lot of new people to poetry. And that's part of it. You talk about how contemporary culture relates, that's certainly an important part of it. But another part of it too has to do with the internet. It's being distributed in a way that has never been distributed before. So more people are gaining access to it. So it's an exciting time to be a poet. It's also a time to be lost in the crowd sometimes, because there's so many people interested in it. But that's okay. Yeah, there's enough to go around. So I would say that poetry is especially intent on being culturally relevant at this moment in history. So that's a good thing.
We usually hear that in times of government or social unease, we see a rise in the arts.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, art becomes even more essential to our spirits. When the times try those spirits. It's true that art thrives especially well in places where there's a dictatorship, for instance. For a long time, Russia has kind of cultivated a very lively culture in response to what has happened politically there.
Really?
And poets are actually feared in that culture. They aren't feared in our culture so much. But that raises the status of poetry. Poetry can be dangerous. You can be thrown into a gulag for writing, the wrong kind of poem. But that tells you something about how important poetry is to that culture, how it's functioning in that culture, that it has that power to be potentially subversive. So that can often happen. But this is one of those interesting things that I've written about considerably because I'm a musician. Raised.
What do you play? What do you play?
Guitar, all different
Really?
kinds of guitar,
And I
yeah,
love
classical
that
and jazz
instrument.
guitar.